Greetings, Internet. Today I wanted to cover the topic of my version of moral realism. As some background information, especially if you're coming from a Christian, theistic, authoritarian perspective, definitely go check out my video on the Euthyphro dilemma, because that video helps unpack from where you are to where I am. And it'll be a lot more probably, hopefully, more receptive to what I have to say in this video if you've watched that video. So, highly recommend that. Anyway, so I'm going to assume that my viewers or my video series are going to want to know at least some idea of where I'm coming from with moral questions. And this video is designed to do that. So, what makes good good? Previously, I asked Christian moral theorists what makes their version of good worthy of being called good. Was it the divine commands? No. Was it the divine nature? No. When does good get defined in a non-arbitrary, non-circular way that has impartial and accurate content? One has to answer the question at some point, even though obviously most people don't, and they just go with intuitive answers. And any meaningful answer from theism, any specific answer, is going to have to end up looking a lot like mine does. So here we go. A suite of preset moral desires. To begin with, before we get into my answer, I think it is thoroughly important to understand why we moralize and even seek these answers to begin with, practically speaking. Psychologist Jonathan Haidt's research identifies 6 emotional axes that our moral sentiments turn on: authority, purity, group loyalty, harm, fairness, and freedom. If you are like the vast majority of humans, then this applies to your psychology to varying degrees. Whatever intellectual constructs you come up with to define your moral theory, assuming you even have one, are mostly, if not entirely, going to be rationalizations forged atop these stock feelings. The reason you moralize at all or care about moral questions is because of these emotional states. If you didn't have them, you probably wouldn't even be asking the question or seeking to explain any hidden reality behind morality land. And people incidentally born with atypical brains who lack some element or many elements or significant degrees of them to the suite of desires may be somewhere on the scale of unreachable in terms of anyone's moral universe. However, it does happen to make plenty of self-interested sense for the majority of actual, say, sociopaths to do what it takes to fit into the moral fabric of human society, and most do in fact work to fit in and are successful at doing so. However, even that kind of systemic and practical appeal only goes so far, especially as we have to deal with science fiction elements like robots, aliens, and gods who may not share our brain structure or basic cooperative interests. The divine is just a reflection of idealized human nature. If you believe in a god or gods, then your gods, if they moralize, will likely moralize within the realm of these 6 axes. If you think gods created our psychology as a reflection of their own image, well, guess what? The divine image is probably an idealized snapshot of these 6 axes. And practically speaking, if you stray too far from this, your school of thought is likely going to sputter and die because no one will care. And if a morally perfect God created human nature, then these 6 axes are a reflection of that moral nature. Notice, we do have this nature, we don't necessarily have that God. When important pieces of your moral theory aren't exactly facts. I'm going to go out on a limb and strongly suggest that you aren't going to be able to prove that your gods exist, or what their natures are like, or what their commands really are. You won't be able to demonstrate that any version of heaven or hell exists, or that any abstract platonic realm where purely abstract moral truths and disembodied properties inexplicably chill out is real. Meanwhile, after thousands and thousands of years of nearly pointless speculation, wishful thinking masquerading as the basis of a moral theory, credulity and/or dogma concerning something more to the equation, we're still going to have these basic truths of human psychology and the task of taking care of ourselves and getting along with each other. Maybe we should start there before we get too wrapped up in other speculative ideas that are never really going to pan out. I strongly recommend it. Jonathan Haidt shows that different groups of people tend to focus on different moral pillars. Conservatives in the United States tend to focus on group affiliation, authority, and purity in about equal parts to harm and fairness, and liberals trend smarter and tend to focus on the harm and fairness. And libertarians trend as high systemizers and low empathizers and may focus almost entirely on liberty. Any moral theory or morality appeal is going to have to adjust to reach out to people with the spectrum of different psychological moral emphases. Our next task is to evaluate these morality feelings in light of each other, reason, and any other relevant evidence to see what they are about and what their strengths and pitfalls are. The most important moral axis. Morality feelings can easily be so powerful that humans in actuality are willing to die on those hills, so to speak, and literally on occasion, and rationalize any argument in their defense or settle for no argument at all. If others just so happen to feel the same way, the moral theory works, but then there are just other people. And your moral theory breaks, so why not fix it? Evolution didn't give us a formal moral theory any more than it gave us formal logic, but it did give us the preset rough draft feelings that it generally takes to get us in the ballpark of acting like we have one. But feelings are just feelings, and to be responsible and be taken at all seriously in the court of the countenance of others and our own sense of righteous impartiality, we must sort them out as impartially as we can. If your sense of righteousness is just, I heed these feelings without further defense, then what have you to say to someone that simply has different feelings? You have no case. Instead, you have perhaps a war. It is very unlikely that you are that much of a purist, though. Obviously, some people come thoughtlessly very close to that. With further introspection, I believe you actually expect your authorities, your groups, and your sense of purity to do something more sophisticated than simply be ends in and of themselves. You expect there to be an underlying point to it. And the obvious answer is in granting you and others impartial well-being and avoiding most forms and degrees of harm in reasonable and responsible ways. Beware, the feelings of authority, group affiliation, and purity are technically independent of the well-being situation, though obviously influenced and highly related to it, and can be given unaccountable and inappropriate disproportionate esteem. If you have noticed other people can feel the wrong thing or feel the right thing too much or too little, then it makes sense to assume you have the same issues that need to be checked, to at least some degree. No one but you and anyone who just so happens to feel like you do are going to agree that your sense of righteousness is right. If someone walks by and yells out, your sense of purity is arbitrary, your culture is inept and doomed, and your authorities don't know what they're talking about, you probably take offense, right? Well, why is that? What moral concept is that getting at? Arguably, authority, group affiliation, and purity are only as good as their tendency to avoid harm. Inept authorities, mindless groups, and dangerous standards of purity that consistently drive their adherents into various shades of self-destruction present good reasons for individuals to exit and disown them. You can call that general sense of self-preservation immoral if you feel like it, but having that feeling is your entire case. If you have to defend it impartially, you'll have to appeal to that which is already the counter-argument. Fairness is only as good as it is good. Even a concern for fairness is only as worthwhile as its ability to avoid harm and promote general well-being. Why be fair? Unfortunately, the indifference of the universe demands an answer. If being unfair made everyone happier, then guess what? There wouldn't be a good reason to listen to the moral umpire, would there? But that is not the case. What else would service the unfortunately part of my sentence above unless there was some reason to care? You know that there is. Individuals living in groups are best served by showing approximate equal concern for all the other individuals in the group, at least when it comes to group issues. Someone who declares at the group meeting, I'm more important than you, is going to be instantly met with, oh no you aren't. Being inconsistent and unfair with other people, in other words, factually misrepresenting their qualities and characteristics, is a recipe for discord and unnecessary struggle that's going to end in everyone losing something. The benefits of unfairness tend to be quite short-sighted and self-sabotaging, and everyone knows this. One wishes, of course, that fairness reigned ontologically supreme and could always be counted on in any and every context. Or we at least want the honorary rights to declare that unfairness matters even when some practical appeal to an agent of injustice falls abysmally flat. But practically speaking, that doesn't actually do us any more good. And no one cares if you are a fairness enthusiast, even when it may not actually be able to apply. Systemic unfairness fails. Majorities who manage to consistently discriminate against minorities are, historically speaking, it seems, cruising for eventual upheaval. As it turns out, as far as humans go, there aren't groups that are better or more important than other groups. So if those artificial lines are culturally drawn and painstakingly maintained, cultural instability and perpetual strife between groups will be the inevitable result. Again, everybody loses something. Slavery used to be a cultural feature across the world, and now there are no countries where it is legal. Human trafficking still happens, but it is criminalized everywhere, and the free world will be righteously seeking its end indefinitely. War and strife of many incarnations, whether over income inequality, race, or whatever else, is that much less likely in a world of general equality. Perhaps some temporary economic argument could be made to prop up slavery in various cultures throughout its long history, but the social one never does, and falls apart when the facts are in. Apart from economic transition costs from one kind of economy to another, paying people for their labor and treating them well is the best sustainable and prosperous approach to take. And I'd wager that slavery isn't. Away from harm is the key. Authorities worth listening to are those who are educated and skilled at avoiding all the incarnations of harm there may be and promoting robust happiness. Groups worth joining are those that provide social environments where we tend to avoid harm and promote happiness. Purity standards worth internalizing are those that actually scale with the facts of the world, where we actually avoid real harm and actually attain real happiness. This suite of desires and concerns generally orients our species as moral members of groups with leadership. But the core idea is obviously the promotion of happiness and the avoidance of harm. In our case, human happiness. Extrapolating from the cultural lessons of expanding our sphere of empathy appropriately, tells us we should care beyond the confines of our species to animals with similar mental attributes and hypothetically about sentient beings with similar suites of social emotions, whether they be robots we engineer with self-aware minds, desires and social emotions, or extraterrestrials who are the products of similar social evolution. It is my belief that pursuing and maintaining happiness requires the principled satisfaction of our most important desires. Long-term, successful, legitimate moral cultures will be firing on all cylinders here, but only after the necessary corrections have been made. Happiness versus harm. And what is happiness? We know that by nature we do tend to want joy, love, self-respect, good friendships, security and trust, commitment, peace and tranquility, sanity, positivity, self-improving behaviors, a sense of purpose and self-worth, and positive social climates. What is harm? We know that by nature we don't tend to want misery, loneliness, self-loathing, bad friendships, fear and paranoia, discontentment, anxiety and stress, neurosis and depression, self-destructive behaviors, purposelessness and worthlessness, and negative social climates. Any moral theory worth listening to is going to point us in the direction of happiness and away from the harm, and serves as an ideological security system to help protect and maintain that journey and destination. Be honest. If you could not recognize the value of these things, or if a moral theory did not protect these things, you wouldn't even bother trying to argue about it. There's a practical reason for human feelings to be the way they are in terms of evolution, and no reason at all for them to be the way they are in terms of theism. It is not difficult in context of evolution, in context of the evolution of successful social group members, why we would be psychologically predisposed to these kinds of behaviors and adverse to the destructive kinds of behaviors. We are the incidental stewards of a long-standing DNA legacy who have to live and get along with each other in order to reproduce and keep the cycle going for future generations to do the same. Anyone who failed too hard at that didn't reproduce, or didn't reproduce as much, and their genes no longer exist or are less represented in future populations. Though evolution got more than it bargained for in our case by producing generalized intelligence that no longer has as much motivation to care about reproduction or evolution. We can just care about sentient experiences. On the other hand, it is metaphysically inexplicable why these values would find their ontological roost in a completely arbitrary divine mind that exists as it does, having no origination event or any constraining factors bring about its existence or constitution. Friendship, for example, enables social animals to cooperate with each other and pool resources for the mutual success of all. Social bonds enable great practical advantages, and our desires have us invest in them regardless of the practical advantages, because we don't necessarily have to be in on the joke in order for evolution's punchline to work. What does friendship mean as a divine reflection coming from the inexplicable nature of an ontologically supreme God? At best, it's supposed to be packaged as a completely uninformative mystery, and at worst, it is just pure and obvious nonsense. And in all likelihood, it just presents the classic case of projecting human values onto a fictional existential support system. I'll stop it there, and part 2 of this video will talk about a science of moral realism, pushing these sensibilities to a scientific perfection.